Good evening. Welcome to another live feed on Shaman's Youth Channel. Get into something different. Get into like a television series kind of thing. Doing an NBA on television kind of series. Maybe do like a series that focus on certain networks that cover sports or sports. So the NBA on NBC obviously made its return this year. The 2025-2026 season, NBA was back on NBC. It was great to see, Maria Taylor, Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, um, Tracy McGrady, and obviously the announcers like Noah Eagle, Mike Tirico, Jamal Crawford, Reggie Miller, whoever was, came back. It was great to see because growing up as a kid, I just watched NBA on NBC, NBA on CBS. TBS had the coverage of the NBA. TNT obviously which no longer has the coverage of the NBA. So it was a great time since we growing up back in the early '90s to see it return. Because the thing about the NBA on NBC, it wasn't always in the 1990s where it got started. No, historically, it goes way back before that. So I want to do the history about the NBA on NBC, the history aspect, the television aspect of covering the NBA during that period of time. Because it spans going back, way back to time. You gotta go back to October 30th, 1954, to April 7th, 1962. That's the last time everything got started. And then it came back on November 3rd, 1990, and it lasted to June 12th, 2002. So now it came back for the third time. It was brought back for the third time. So when you look at the NBA on NBC, it was first televised from 1954 to 1962. In 1990, the NBA returns to NBC under a multi-year contract, which coincided with the dynastic run of Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. The league rose to unprecedented popularity with ratings surpassing the days of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird in the mid-1880s. So NBC's coverage ended after the 2001-2002 season after a 12-year run when NBC outbidded for the broadcast television contract by Disney via ABC. So in July 2024, it was announced that NBC Universal had regained the rights to the NBA on a new contract beginning this past season, 2025-2026 season, under the title NBA on NBC and NBA on Peacock, which will see that coverage on NBC and streaming platform Peacock. And this NBC SN was later added in November to televise some playoff games and televise Monday games. But you gotta take it back, man. That's the thing about it. Everything starts from the beginning, as the origins of the NBA on NBC. And it started on October 30th, 1954, that lasted until April 7th, 1962. The very first NBA telecast was a game between the Boston Celtics, Rochester Boys, and Rochester. That's where it all started. Then Marty Glickman and Lindsey Nelson, they called all the games except on April 9th between Fort Wayne and Syracuse during the playoffs, and Glickman worked with Jim Gordon. So Nelson would later write in his autobiography, Hello, Everybody, I'm Lindsey Nelson. That NBA commissioner, Maurice Parloff, would travel to the televised games, and when NBC needed to get in a commercial, he would go up to one of the coaches and say, call timeout. They had to, since the commissioner ordered. So on March 19, 1955, during the playoffs, NBC gave the national spotlight to the New York Knicks and the rising Boston Celtics at the New York City's Madison Square Garden. The first year of NBC's tenure, the first 5 weeks of coverage followed a Canadian Football League game. That contract decreed that the network show 13 games. Presumably the Grey Cup on Saturday afternoon was beginning in late August and was signed 1 week after the NBC had lost the rights to NCAA football to ABC. The following year, Lindsey Nelson was paired with Kurt Gotti on commentary for all games except on February 25th. St. Louis at New York, so March 3rd, Minneapolis at Rochester with Nelson, worked with John Latchett. March 24th, Fort Wayne, St. Louis with Nelson working alone. So then on March 31st, 1956, NBC broadcast the first nationally televised NBC Finals game. It was Game 1 of the Fort Wayne Philadelphia series. Gowdy and Nelson was retained as the primary broadcasting team for NBC in 1956-57, except on March 23rd and 30th. St. Louis at Boston, so when Nelson worked by himself, while the team of Gowdy and Nelson again did most games in 1957-58, Nelson worked the December 14th telecast, Syracuse at Detroit with Chick Hearn. When he returned, worked the January 11th telecast, Syracuse at Cincinnati with Biondi. For the January 18th telecast, Detroit at St. Louis. Nelson worked alone while at February 1st. Syracuse at Minneapolis. Nelson was paired with Bill O'Donnell. Meanwhile, Gotti worked alone on March 1st, Cincinnati at Philadelphia. NBC also, during the 1957-58 season, broadcast a game in Detroit between Cincinnati and the Pistons on March 15th, had this game on a flight home to Cincinnati so that Maurice Stokes became ill, suffering later a seizure, fell into a coma, and was left permanently paralyzed. This was a delayed reaction from him and hit his head in a game 3 days earlier. Stokes died in April 1970, so in the 1958-59 season, Gotti worked alone on all games except on March 15th. April 5th, the 1959 NBA All-Star Game marked the first time that the All-Star Game was nationally televised. NBC only broadcast the second half at 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time at the time. The fact that the All-Star Game prior to this was almost always played on a Tuesday night, and the NBC would have had sacrificed most, if not all the evening programming in the first few years. So that would have made taking off Merton Burroughs' program, which was starting to slide, but still would have made more money for the network than the pro basketball game. So NBA owners weren't terribly savvy when it came to working with television in this era. So they probably refused network requests and put it in a weekend afternoon slot. During the 1959-60 season, Kirk Gotti worked alone most on Saturday games, and Lindsey Nelson worked alone mostly on Sunday games. So Nelson also worked on Saturday, April 2nd, St. Louis at Boston during the playoffs. Mark Whitey Blakeman worked alone on December 6th. St. Louis at Cincinnati, January 2nd to the 3rd. Knicks and Cincinnati. Boston and Syracuse, February 28th. Philadelphia, Detroit, March 13th. Philadelphia at Syracuse. 20th, March 20th, Boston at Philadelphia. March 27th, St. Louis at Boston. April 3rd, Boston at St. Louis. Finally, Bill O'Donnell worked alone on March 12th. Minneapolis at Detroit. March 19th, St. Louis at Minneapolis. March 26th, Minneapolis at St. Louis. Next 66-61 season. Lindsey Nelson was alone on all games except when worked with Bob Plummer on October 22nd, New York at Cincinnati. October 29th, New York at Detroit. November 26th, Syracuse at Boston. December 3rd, New York at Syracuse. Syracuse at Detroit. December 10th, December 24th, Detroit at Boston. Jerry Doggett helped call games on November 5th. Syracuse at Los Angeles. November 19th, Detroit at Los Angeles. Artie Goodman contributed to commentary on January 8th, Boston at St. Louis. January 15th, Philadelphia at Syracuse. January 22nd, St. Louis at Cincinnati. January 29th, Philadelphia at Boston. February 19th, Boston at Syracuse. 26th, Boston at Detroit. March 12th, Boston at Syracuse. March 19th, Syracuse at Boston. March 26th, Syracuse at Boston. Then April 2nd, St. Louis at Boston. So we had a final season, NBC's final season of their first stint with the NBA. Bud Palmer worked alone on commentary on all games except for February 3rd, Cincinnati at New York. So April 7th, Los Angeles at Boston when he was paired with Bob Wolf. Now, NBC ratings during this time period were lukewarm at best. By 1962, NBA ratings for NBC's Saturday afternoon games dipped to 4.8 million viewers, as compared to Sunday afternoon NFL ratings of 10.4, 15 million viewers. As a matter of fact, CBS at one point getting better ratings for the National Hockey League, telecasting NBC was game with the NBA. One possible factor for the dipping ratings is the fact that NBC's 1960-1961 schedule placed the three weakest teams, like Cincinnati, Syracuse, Detroit, on television on a total of 14 times. So in comparison to the NBA's best teams, Boston, St. Louis, Philadelphia, appeared on NBC a total of 7 times. Now, let's get to the second iteration, 1990-2002. Now, this is during my generation. Obviously, I was alive during this time, obviously, from the 90s all the way to now. But during that period, I definitely remember when NBC, if you see in the thumbnail, The NBA on NBC once you get a chance to check it out. On November 9th, 1989, the NBA reached an agreement with NBC worth $600 million to broadcast NBA games for 4 years, beginning with the 1990-91 season. So you begin a new era, a new decade of doing this. And then on April 28, 1993, NBC extended exclusive broadcast rights to the NBA, the 4 year, $750 million contract. So the coverage in the NBA began on Christmas Day each season, with the exception of the inaugural season, 1990, which was November 3rd, 1990, between the Lakers and the Spurs. And the 1997-98 season, which features terms featuring the Chicago Bulls. 1998, 98, 99 season had no Christmas games due to the lockout at the time. And the final season of NBC's contract, 2001 and 2002, which included 2 early season games featuring the return of Michael Jordan to the NBA, but this time as an older player for the Washington Wizards. You see aired the All-NBA All-Star game every year, usually at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. In 2002, NBC aired the game an hour early at 5 p.m. due to Winter Olympics. But in 2000, during the NBA playoffs coverage, there were triple headers on Saturdays and Sundays during the first 2 weeks of the season of the playoffs. And NBC will air a double header on Saturday and followed by a triple header on Sunday. So in 2000, on December 30th, the NBC aired a rare game, a second game in December. Saturday matchup was the only time that NBC aired a game between Christmas Day, start of the regular season, or games in February. So in 2001, NBC was scheduled to air an October preseason game for an NBA team playing an international team. Game was canceled due to the September 11th attacks. During the 2001-2002, and Jordan became injured during the middle of the season. Placed the added Wizards games with the games that had been originally on schedule. So look at the pregame. You had NBA Showtime that lasted from 1990 to 2000. Bob Costas was the original host. He did that from 1990 to 1995, 96. Then Hannah Storm took over as host 1996, 1997. Then Mark Rashad did it when Storm was in maternity leave, stuff like that. And they had the sponsors like Prudential Financial and Net Zero and Verizon, Wireless, stuff like that. You had so much stuff. Then you had the John Test theme music that was great. The Black Hole, that was like the soundtrack all the time, still is today. And the ratings was excellent on that time again because of the Bulls and their run, throughout the 90s, except for 1999 finals. But at the time, in 98, the Bulls Utah series, when they met the second time, did an 18.7 rating. And then in 1999, it plummeted. The viewership was very low. These game telecast was very low. Stuff like that. In 2002, NBC set a record highest rated Western Conference final between the Lakers and the Kings, 14.2 for Game 7. Then they got the third iteration, obviously, this season. It's back on NBC, so that's basically it. Just looking at the history of the coverage of the NBA on NBC. You had the broadcasters, you can't forget, in the beginning, it was like, as it returned back to in the 90s, you had Marv Albert and Mike Patel. They were the number one crew, number one announcing team. They had Dick Enberg, Steve Snapper Jones. They were the B team. The A team was Mike Fratello, Marv Albert, and Mike Rashad, and Dick Enberg, and Steve Snapper Jones. And then you had Rashad, Jim Gray, and a Storm doing sideline duties and reporting. Joe Myers, he was doing solid reporting as well. Bob Costas did the pregame show, NBA Showtime. And Don Crick and Joe Myers did the games play-by-play at times as well. Magic Johnson was able to become a team top game analyst alongside Alexa Ember or Patel, but his performance was heavily criticized. The complaints was his poor diction skills, stating the obvious, his habitual reference to his playing days, and overall lackluster chemistry with his broadcasting partner. So it was like he was phased out. So at the 1993 NBA Finals. So Mike Fratello left the booth to become the coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and here comes Matt Guokas, and they had a good broadcasting team along with Bill Walton. So he's able to do the two NBA Finals as a three-man booth. Also, you had Steve Snapper Jones and Walton do games with Dick Enberg, Tom Havin, and Greg Gumbel. In the late 90s, unfortunately 97, the last time I ever called the NBA Finals for NBC during this decade because of the set scandal. He was forced NBC to fire Albert. And then here comes Bob Costas. He took over. Matt Hughes did not return to his post, and they replaced with Isaiah Thomas. So Ham Storm did the pregame show. We had Doc Collins joining Costas and Thomas. So they had their trio. Then Greg Gomes was still doing his thing. He made NBC as a secondary announcer. And he joined CBS. And Tom Hammond came in. So Costas, Thomas, and Cos did the majority of the games, the major games, including 1998 NBA Finals. And here comes Mike Breen, who's a backup announcer to Albert on MSG's network New York broadcast for the Knicks. So I do play-off games with Mike Breen. He's doing his great job with ABC, ESPN, stuff like that. So that's the story of what was going on at NBC before they got the package back, So that's it. That's all I gotta say. So tune in. I'll be back with another live feed tonight. Till then, talk to you soon.